Two things that leap out at me when I reflect on these two readings is, number one, accountability, personal accountability, and remembering. The message that God is teaching his people way back in the time of Ezekiel is as relevant today as it needed to be taught back then. And that is, and it's a whole discussion about personal accountability with the people in Ezekiel's time because of the whole idea of collective sin and so on, that 1,000 generations shall pay for my sins, and if you read Deuteronomy. But this developed notion that each of us is accountable for our own sins. We shouldn't say take it for granted, but it's part of our moral system, it's part of our relationship with God. That I am responsible for my own actions. And therefore, I either benefit, and presumably others might benefit as well from my good actions, my merit, or I incur the responsibility or the spiritual debt as a result of my sins. And of course, others may suffer from my sins as well. But they can actually grow in grace if they handle it in the right way. I have to incur personally the debt as a result of my own sins. And it's relevant today because we have this really keen way of blinding ourselves. I mean, just remember Pius XII, way back in the 50s, when 80, maybe 70% of Catholics were going to church, 80% of Catholics going to church. He said the greatest sin of the century was the ignoring of sin, was the denial of sin. Back in the 50s, when the vast majority of Catholics were going to confession on a weekly basis. The question is, were they going with the right formation? Were they it was a checklist? Was it a superficial thing? Were they really entering into a personal relationship with Jesus Christ and confessing their sins? Only God knows this, but the statistics indicate no. Because right after the council, it was like lemmings falling off a cliff. Whereas if they had solid formation, it would be, we know what this is all about, and your wonky interpretation of the council is not going to affect me going to confession. That's where we want people to be at. Because there was a lot of stupid teaching or false teaching about the council after the Second Vatican Council. People didn't have to go to confession, no need to do penance, blah, 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 went on and on and on, with few people having read the documents. So if Pius XII said that way back then, and Sheen repeated it, Archbishop Sheen, it's even more relevant today, that we have this amazing ability to blind ourselves to my sin and what I've done. Now, that doesn't mean going overboard and pummeling myself into the ground, but it also means, not taking it lightly or knowing how to distinguish between what we call venial and mortal sin and taking responsibility. And our Lord uses a word that we also need to kind of appropriate to ourselves, and he says, remember. Remember. And the way we remember these things is through the examination of conscience. When we remember our actions in the presence of Jesus, that's where an examination of conscience can be done, should be done actually. Is just as brief, Lord, I'm in your presence, I want you to be present to me as I make this examination of my day, this brief examination, which doesn't mean superficial. Brief means it shouldn't be some long protracted monologue with myself, but I get to the point. I analyze the situation. I did this, I did that. I'm truly sorry for it. Please forgive me. If I need to go to confession, I will. I will go to confession when I should go. That's two different things, right? It's the confession of devotion for even venial sins or character faults, which all too often is not preached anymore. And it should be, because that's why we get in the doo-doo we get into, in our personal lives and in societies. We don't take these things seriously. You add a little pebble on a bridge, nothing happens. Add 100 pebbles or 1,000 or 10,000 pebbles, and then the bridge may begin to buckle, and that's when people have huge fights or something really happens because they didn't pay attention to the pebbles. The pebbles are not boulders, the pebbles are pebbles. So venial sins and character faults matter, and we should be taking this to our Lord in the regular reception of the sacrament of penance. So we benefit from the grace he wants to pour out upon us. So, and then of course we know, confess the mortal sins before communion. So God is teaching his people through Ezekiel about personal responsibility. And you and I need to cultivate a healthy sense, especially during Lent, because it's kind of a time of focus. To remember, to cultivate the practice of the examination of conscience. It's so valuable. All the saints who ever talked about any of these things always talk about how valuable and how important it is, how much we should invest in doing it really well. For love, not because it's a duty, not because we're obsessive compulsive, but out of love for Jesus, because we want to be more and more like him. So let us ask our Lord to help us really accept this personal responsibility, trusting that he always desires to forgive us, and to help us remember, because we're so prone to forget and deny.